Hello and welcome. This is Wilrens for Create a Learning Site, the place to go deeper in your understanding of the Bible. Narrative criticism. The term is a bit misleading. Narrative criticism is not about critiquing authors and their stories. As with all the various criticisms that are practiced in biblical studies, it is a way to approach a biblical text and analyze, not critique or criticize it from a chosen perspective. In the case of narrative criticism, it is about understanding a story as story, that is, seeking to comprehend how the story works. It is a relatively new approach, developed in the later 20th century, and underlying it is the conviction that the books of the Bible should also be understood as literature. This is perhaps more obvious for a book like Job than for, say, Judges or one of the Gospels, but it is increasingly recognized that most, if not all, the books of the Bible are careful, even artistic constructions. Someone creatively put these texts together, and it is important to pay attention to this dimension of the text. And in the case of narratives, this means reading the stories as stories. Here's an additional reason to engage in narrative criticism. There is a problem that is peculiar to narratives in the Bible, and it has to do with application. Usually, stories mainly describe what happened. They don't tell us directly what is right or wrong. It's often not very obvious what the lesson or absolute or norm or principle, timeless truth if you will, is that we should take away from the text, from the story. Narrative criticism helps us to notice the hints and clues that are hidden in the text. This enables us to see more clearly what the text expects us to embrace or reject. So how does one do this? I was surprised to find how many elements of narrative criticism we take into account, perhaps unwittingly, as we follow the inductive approach in courses like the School of Biblical Studies and the Bible Core course. A story consists of characters, events, and settings such as time and place. Much of this is caught by answering the basic Bible study questions. Who, what, where, when, and so forth. An additional element in stories is made up by rhetorical devices and figures of speech. This should also be familiar to anyone who's been introduced to inductive Bible study. And then there are what some call narrative patterns, which are essentially laws of composition, the way the elements are brought together and given shape, such as repetition, comparison, contrast, and so forth. In other words, if you are involved in SBS or BCC, you may engage in more narrative criticism than you are aware of. In what follows, I'm going to look at 5 basic elements at the heart of narrative criticism in more detail. Every story needs location and time, both in the sense of a point in time when the story is happening, and in the sense of duration of time, that is, how long things take. At times, statements about place or time convey more than just setting. When something happens at night, for instance, or on a mountain, we have to wonder that Judas left Jesus at the Last Supper to betray him, and then we are told, and it was night, conveys a sense of darkness, that the transfiguration of Jesus took place on a mountain perhaps is intended to make us think of God's appearance on Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus. So setting can be more than just time and place. In addition to these two, there's also the social or cultural setting, which together with some other things basically makes up the historical background or setting of the story. In every story, there will be one or more characters. Some of these will be more important than others. In fact, some may be part of the setting more than that they function as real people. We learn about these characters, especially the ones that are central to the story, both by what we are told about them directly and by what we can see in the story, their actions, their speech, sometimes even their thoughts. Based on this, we ascribe certain character traits to them and infer what they believe and what they value. As a result, we either like or dislike a character. In this, we are actually being led by a character that may be quite hidden in the text and that we don't normally think of as a character in the story. And this is the narrator. In biblical narrative, this narrator is usually identical with the implied author. That is, the author that becomes visible in the text. Now, yet another unusual character is the implied reader. This is the reader that the narrator has in mind. It is the ideal reader for this text. A construct, not a real person. As such, the narrator will assume that the reader knows certain things. A simple example is ancient measures of weight. We may lack this information and will then have to find it somewhere else, because in Powell's words, we need to have the historical information that the text assumes of its implied reader. In case all this talk about implied authors and readers sounds overly complicated, there is a significant benefit from this way of thinking about texts. Inductive Bible study asks for the intended meaning of the author, but often enough we don't know or are uncertain who the author is, and we do not have direct access to him. All we have is the text. The same applies to the intended audience of a text. Narrative criticism puts the focus on the text, which we have in front of us, not on people that are perhaps largely unknown and certainly inaccessible to us, or worse, speculative and hypothetical sources. We do not know what was going on in the mind of, for instance, Paul or Jesus, but we do know something about the author or narrative and the implied reader that becomes visible in a text. Even if we don't know the name of an author, we can still know something about him, or at least his representative, the implied author narrator in the text. This enables us to not be overly concerned with or hindered by questions of authorship and dates in our interpretation. To have a story, something must happen. A sequence of events takes place that are in some way related. How they are related is more a function of plot, more about plot later, but to understand the plot we must first notice the events, what actually happens. Element number 4 is point of view. In one sense, the point of view simply is the position of the narrator. From where does he view the events recounted in the story? But more importantly, point of view asks for the norms and values and the worldview that the story promotes. This is sometimes called the ideological or conceptual point of view. What are the standards of judgment? How are we to evaluate action, dialogue, characters, setting, and events in the story? In principle, the narrator will help us to answer these questions. The way a story is told reveals the norms, values, beliefs, and general worldview that the narrator wants the reader to adopt or to reject. As noted above, the challenge with narratives is application, to determine what is right and normative. Narrative criticism enables us to wrestle with this problem and helps us to come up with answers. So how can we go about uncovering the point of view of a narrative? The most obvious way a narrator can guide us is through comments, information or statements that are not part of the events. Think of the book of Judges, for instance. It repeats this phrase a number of times. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eye. This is an implicit judgment on what is happening in the book and an important key to the overall message. Another important clue is when we are told about the inner life of characters, their thoughts or emotions, things that are not normally knowable. Important is also how characters relate to each other and what their statements and comments are. For this, however, it's crucial to determine the standing of each character in the narrative. For instance, if Jesus says something, we can assume the narrator wants us to take this as true and reliable. If the disciples say or do something in the Gospels, we cannot be quite so sure. We must carefully consider the context to know if they are on the right track or not. Often enough, they are not. When it's the Pharisees and Sadducees, we can basically assume their words and actions are to be evaluated negatively unless the context points in a different direction. Now, often the clues are quite subtle and we need to draw inferences from repetitions and other observations. This calls for caution because we can obviously overinterpret the text and read things into it that aren't there. But if we don't take these hints into account, we underinterpret the text, which is also not good. Element number 5 is the plot. The plot is the way the story is told, the storyline. This is where the pieces are brought together. They are linked through elements like causation and conflict. Ideally, at this point, we understand what the story aimed to accomplish and are therefore able to apply its lesson or principle in our own circumstances. So here we are. Setting, characters, events, point of view, and plot make up the story. Each of these elements can be taken as a focus to study a book or story by tracing its appearance and function throughout the story. It's worth the effort because the power of story is precisely that it does more and impacts us deeper than theological truth and absolutes, doctrine, ethical guidelines, and even practical principles. This is why the Bible is a storybook.
The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience. The show will be starting in just a few moments.